What happens when the editor becomes the story? That's the question I want you to think about. And when you're done, I want to hear your thoughts in the comments. Do you still trust mainstream journalism? Or has the BBC's latest scandal just confirmed what many of us already suspected, that the truth has become a casualty of the narrative? Because this one isn't just any old media controversy. This is something deeper, something that says more about the world of news than any headline or expose ever could. In the annals of media missteps, few moments carry weight or irony quite like this one. The British Broadcasting Corporation, the BBC, the institution that built its identity on the promise of impartiality, now finds itself accused of the very sin it has long condemned: distortion, bias. Founded a century ago to inform, educate, and entertain, the BBC once stood as the gold standard of public broadcasting. I don't know about you, but I'm definitely old enough to remember those days. The BBC, it projected moral authority from its headquarters in Broadcasting House. And this is important. Its funding came from the compulsory license fee paid by every TV-owning household in Britain. So no private funding and no direct government funding either. And built on that, the image of ethics, principle, high moral ground. But on the 9th of November 2025, that image cracked wide open. Two of the network's biggest names, Director General Tim Davie and new CEO Deborah Turness, abruptly resigned. Why did they resign? Because of a scandal born from one edit, one deceptively simple splice of audio that set off a media earthquake. The culprit was a panorama documentary titled Trump, A Second Chance. It aired in October in 2024, just days before the US presidential election. And in that film, BBC editors took fragments from a speech Donald Trump had made on the 6th of January 2021 and stitched them together into something very different. Watch this.
We're going to walk down to the Capitol, and I'll be there with you. And we fight. We fight like hell. We're going to walk down to the Capitol, and we're going to cheer on our brave senators and congressmen and women.
In reality, Trump told supporters to peacefully and patriotically make your voices heard early in his 76-minute speech. Only much later, almost a full hour later, did he say, "We fight like hell." But in the BBC's version, those two moments were fused seamlessly into one sentence.
We're going to walk down to the Capitol, and I'll be there with you. And we fight. We fight like hell.
Saw that? A few seconds of slick editing turned rhetoric into what sounded like a command. It left out calls for peaceful demonstration, and that change, that decision, crossed a line. Also, very interesting, the story broke when Michael Prescott, a former advisor to the BBC's Editorial Guidelines and Standards Committee, leaked internal documents to The Telegraph. He accused the corporation of misleading viewers and warned that editorial decisions had been warped by bias, not by accident, but by culture. His dossier wasn't just about the Trump video. He detailed years of growing partisanship, from how the BBC framed transgender issues to how its Arabic service handled the Gaza war. TLDR, Prescott said what many had been whispering for a long time, that the BBC's moral compass had begun to tilt. Inside Broadcasting House, panic. Within hours, resignations. Davie's note to staff read like an eulogy for trust itself. "Ultimate responsibility rests with me," that's what he wrote. And Turness echoed him, expressing regret, insisting that the BBC had made mistakes, but denying systemic bias. Outside, though, the storm was raging. And you know why. This is not just about any newsroom, it's the BBC. And it's about its very identity as the upholder of journalistic integrity. And in the eye of this storm, the person they misrepresented, not a British politician or a royal, out of all the people in the world they could have picked, it was Donald Trump. On the 10th of November, Trump's legal team delivered a bombshell to the BBC, a formal letter demanding a full retraction and on-air apology and $1 billion. Yes, $1 billion in compensation for what they called intentional deception. Failure to comply by Friday, the letter warned, an instant lawsuit. Trump's camp seized the narrative, and why not? They're no strangers to taking on the press. Just that this time, the target was across the pond. The president's son, Donald Trump Jr., blasted the BBC as just as dishonest as CNN. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt called the BBC a taxpayer-funded propaganda machine. And Trump himself, he apparently told aides this wasn't about money, it was about principle. His message was pretty blunt. It's time the fake news paid for lying. Back in Britain, reactions were explosive. For critics of the BBC, it was vindication, proof that the corporation had its own agenda. Conservative lawmakers renewed calls to defund the BBC. Editorialists at The Spectator and GB News accused the broadcaster of systemic elitism, of being what they called London media for London minds. Now, others tried to defend the network, tagging it an unfortunate error of judgment. Samir Shah, the BBC's chairman, described the edit as a mistake that gave the impression of a direct call for violent action. But that explanation didn't calm anyone. It just fanned the flames. But hang on a minute, this is hardly the first time the BBC's halo has slipped, right? Remember the Hutton inquiry in 2004 over the BBC's Iraq war reporting? Or the Jimmy Savile scandal, which exposed years of institutional blindness? Or the uproar when Gary Lineker's political tweets triggered a mass revolt among presenters? Each time, the BBC apologized, restructured, and promised to learn. But what's different this time? Well, for one, we live in a different era, where Reels and TikToks and YouTube videos both add to the noise and strip away the wall between media and audience. The space for high moral ground is shrinking. In fact, I'd say it's disappeared altogether, right? Second, this wasn't about what the BBC failed to report, it was about what it manufactured. Let's be blunt. This was editing intent, not editing for clarity. A fusion that altered meaning, not presentation. And when the world's most trusted broadcaster manipulates a president's words, and remember the timing just weeks before an election, the implications go far beyond one country's borders. For Trump's base, it's the ultimate vindication. Yes, look, proof of a global conspiracy of elites out to discredit him. For the BBC's defenders, it's an agonizing embarrassment, a gift to populists everywhere. And for everyone else, there's really only one question. Can any news outlet still be trusted? Polls already show trust in UK media at record lows, barely 50%. And after this, it'll fall further, because trust, once lost, is almost impossible to rebuild. Inside the BBC, insiders are whispering about reform. Some say abolish the license fee, that £159 annual charge that every household pays. Others call for privatization, or they're pitching a subscription-based model like Netflix. There are talks of stricter editorial audits, external watchdogs, and bias panels. But you know what? None of that fixes credibility. That's the uncomfortable truth. You can change the structure, but if the culture stays the same, the problem does too. And the problem with the BBC is a big problem. Michael Prescott, remember the Whistleblower, his report says it plainly. Impartiality is no longer the default posture, it's an inconvenience. He cited how language choices, replacing words like breastfeeding with chest feeding, reflect ideological capture. He pointed out how there was a selection bias against amplifying stories about migration and asylum seekers, and how some stories suggested a racism angle when there was none. The BBC's Arabic service was called overly critical of Israel. Now, you may agree with some of these points, you may not with some others. After all, we all have our own biases, and when the media doesn't take the stand we agree with, we'd call it unfair. Trump's critics argue that regardless of editing, his rhetoric on the 6th of January was still inflammatory. that peacefully or not, his words did help fuel chaos. But when a broadcaster changes facts, changes what actually happened to suit a narrative, that's not an editorial stand. That's misrepresentation. And the question here isn't about Trump's guilt, it's about journalism's integrity. The BBC didn't invent Trump's words, it rearranged them. And in doing so, it rearranged reality. And when journalists start rearranging reality to fit a narrative, it's democracy that takes the hit. The fallout isn't just political, it's existential. Because if the BBC can no longer claim moral authority, what happens to every other news outlet built on its model? What happens when audiences stop believing anyone? The irony is bitter. For decades, the BBC positioned itself as a check against misinformation, against manipulation. Now it stands accused of the same crime by the world's most powerful man. And Trump, always the showman, is turning that into a political weapon. His lawsuit might be symbolic, but his narrative? It's powerful. He's always painted himself as the man the media tried to destroy, and now even Britain's public broadcaster is part of the plot. It's easy to dismiss that as theatre, but history shows every time the media underestimates Trump, he grows stronger. So, here we are, a century-old broadcaster under siege, a president suing a foreign media giant, an audience torn between cynicism and outrage, and the $1 billion question: who do we trust? Did the BBC's edit cost it more than credibility? Did it hand Trump yet another victory in his endless war against the press? Because in the end, this isn't just a British story, it's a global warning, a reminder that in an age of AI, deepfakes, and partisan echo chambers, even the institutions we trust most can be tempted to airbrush and edit, to remake the truth. This is APT Opinion. Trust no one. Today, the bigger they are, the more they're tempted to paint their own truths. The bigger they are, the bigger the players trying to influence their coverage. Was the BBC simply careless, or did it cross the line into propaganda? Let me know what you think in the comments below. I hope you're already subscribed to our YouTube channel, and we're carrying the conversation forward on Substack too. You can subscribe to that through the link in the description. Because this story, this moment, isn't about Trump versus the BBC. It's about us. It's about you and me, and the fragile, fading line between fact and faith in those who tell it.